Thanks, Ross. So I have some slides and we'll just go through them here. My background is I've been a consultant for 20 or so years, and back in another life, I used to run Bonneville, and before that, Seattle City Lights. So I've been dealing with these issues for about 40 years and have acquired at least some knowledge associated with that background. So let's dive in and go. My presentation compared to Megan's and Vic's is going to be quite specific relative to some of the issues that your work group will be dealing with. First, the current situation. Both Oregon and Washington have legislation that requires them to be 80% clean energy, when that clean includes renewables and hydro as part of that by 2030. Item number 2 is what their current status is. Puget is about 35% clean, needs to get to 80 in 8 years. PG, I don't know an exact figure, but it's about 40 to 50 and needs to get to that same point. Item number 3 on the slide indicates kind of what the capacity and energy needs are, but between now and roughly 2030 for those two utilities who are the neediest, I guess you'd say, relative to the amount of renewables that they need to acquire to meet their 2030 goals. Basically, if you look at that and sum it up, about 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of energy by 2030 for both utilities, and 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts of capacity. Major potential problems. You've got 2 issues here, and probably a third that I didn't list, but probably should have. East to west transfer capability is a significant problem. All of your renewables and frankly, most of your capacity resources that you would need to build are going to be located on the east side, and the loads are all in Seattle and Portland and in those areas. So you have significant potential transmission issues. One is on Cross Cascade North, which is the pathway, basically the I-90 corridor from the mid-Columbias or further east to Seattle or Puget Sound area. And the second is Cross Cascade South, which is the same pattern along I-84 to get from the east side to Portland. Another potential one that I didn't list is the Raver-Paul line. It's a single circuit 500 line that runs from Federal Way down to Centralia, but it tends to get overloaded depending upon how the flows go on Cross Cascade North and South as well, even though it isn't a Cross Cascade line per se. Next slide, please. So the most recent concrete data that we have comes from the Bonneville 2021 cluster study. Bonneville does an annual cluster study to look at all the transmission service requests, abbreviated TSRs that are filed. The most recent one was released in June of last year and analyzed TSRs submitted between mid 2019 and mid 2020. You had about almost 6 gigawatts or 5,800 megawatts of TSR submitted. Probably most significant about this was Bonneville found that basically flows seeking to go from mid-C to PGE, ironically, overloaded the Raver-Paul 500 line that I mentioned earlier, and it required a $750 million fix, not for all of those TSRs, but for some of them in the queue. You reached a point where they essentially overloaded that line. Not surprisingly, faced with that kind of spending that kind of money to get an upgrade, all of the people who submitted those TSRs withdrew their TSRs when facing the next step of the line. Now, the most likely, what I'll call incremental upgrades are the 2 items listed in item number 4. Raver-Schultz series capacitors. These are not lines. These are devices that are put in that enable you to redirect power from overloaded lines to lesser loaded lines. You can see the subscription data there for that one. And a Portland area 230 upgrade. This involves both Bonneville lines and PGE lines or PGE equipment. And again, probably fully subscribed. I would expect a Bonneville decision probably later this year to proceed with the Raver-Schultz SCPs. That'll give you another 500 megawatts of ATC, which is on the Cross Cascade north path. And similarly, the Portland area one we're probably a year and a half away from a decision to proceed because of the coordination between Bonneville and PGE. But that also gives you another 500 megawatts of incremental ATC on the Cross Cascade South path. Next slide, please. So where are we right now? You've got about probably 5,000 megawatts, give or take, in the current Bonneville queue, but that doesn't include all the stuff that they're currently analyzing in the 2022 cluster study. That's only as of the 2021 cluster study and things before it. Probably of that 5,000, probably 3,000, 3,500 need Cross Cascade north or south. And the amount of TSRs that are being submitted is steadily increasing, as you can see from the data here from the previous cluster studies. Basically, with the Oregon and Washington legislation, you've got a gold rush going on, where the amount of renewable projects submitted and the need transmission are increasing steadily, or basically almost doubling every year. So Bonneville is currently in the process of analyzing the 11 gigawatts, or it's 11,000 megawatts of TSRs that were submitted as of mid-August of last year, and we'll have those results in June, hopefully. Another item that could play a role in this is Puget Sound Energy's RFP for resources has at least raised the possibility of Puget acquiring dual fuel. These would be presumptively biodiesel and natural gas fueled CTs that would be located on the west side. And these could lessen the amount of east to west transmission capability that you needed, because you'd have the fuel like other CTs on the west side and in Puget service territory or near enough to it, and would lessen the amount of ATC, available transmission capability, that you need to get that capacity resource from somewhere on the east side to the west side. So that's an advantage. It also would provide what's called VAR support, basically would help with the stability on the west side as the last Centralia unit retires in 2025. That's a fairly technical issue, but it's a very important one. And then finally, the near-term upgrades that were in item 4 on the previous slide, the Raber-Schultz SCPs and the Portland 230 upgrade will help meet your renewable acquisition needs in the next 4 years. They're not as likely to be, that capacity is likely to be pretty much used up relative to the amount of clean energy needs that you have between 2026 and 2030. Key here is that we should know a lot more about these issues in June of this year. Bonneville's 2022 cluster study will come out, and we probably will have the short lists from both the Puget and the Portland General resource RFPs. So we'll have a lot more data on, okay, what's the transmission situation look like from Bonneville perspective, and then what resources are Puget and PGE planning to acquire in the next 4-year period. And that should tell us a lot more about what our out-year transmission circumstances are. Next slide, please. So in addition to having sufficient transmission to capacity to wheel the renewable energy across the Cascades to get to Seattle or Portland, you got a couple of what I'll call coping strategies. Puget is definitely going to use these. I'm less certain about how Portland General is approaching it, but 1 and 2 are kind of the key to this amount. First, you can repurpose transmission currently used to wheel thermal power to use wind, solar, and in Montana's case, pump storage potentially to loads. A good example of this is the cold strip 3 and 4 transmission. If cold strip 3 and 4 shut down in 2025, as is widely projected, that'll free up about 400 megawatts of transmission that is used for wheel cold strip power that you could use for Montana wind and or pump storage for Puget, and 300 megawatts for Portland General. The Portland General is probably already pretty much committed to their Clearwater wind project that they've got. And Puget is already planning to use the 300 megawatts that they had from Colstrip 1 and 2 shutting down to wheel that. So you can repurpose the transmission. You can do this, but it's complicated. It's doable, but you got to go and reevaluate your N-1/-1 reliability contingencies, and where are you going to get that if one of these resources goes out, and you got to look at bar support again, the voltage stability issues. You have a lot of big spinning mass with the Colstrip units that provides the stability need for the grid. The wind resources don't give you that. Now you can install inverters, you can do other things that will compensate for that, and you probably will need to do that, but there's a fair amount of work that needs to be done before you can wheel that power in the way that it's currently wheeled from Colstrip. The second strategy is to co-locate wind and solar resources near existing thermal resources, or other resources for that matter. And you can basically assign, it's called redirect in the Bonneville terminology, not in all cases, but in many cases, the transmission that was previously used for the thermal resources to be used for the wind resources. And you can add batteries to that equation. And again, you can substitute, in essence, renewable wind or solar power for wind power, or excuse me, for thermal power. This is more CT power here to wheel that energy across the Cascades. Again, it's not simple, but it's doable. And you have a fair amount, as item 4 indicates, strategies to, that can do this. So go to the next slide, please. So what are the implications of this, and kind of where are we? Well, first off, it's not clear whether either Puget or PGE have sufficient long-term firm, which is the quality of transmission that most utilities require and most commissions require to serve load. They have long-term firm transmission to meet your 2030 energy goals. Basically, Puget thinks it has enough with the strategies that I listed before. Portland General is pretty clear in saying they don't have enough. So you've got a lot of issues in terms of, do you have sufficient transmission to meet your 2030 goals? Maybe, and maybe not. And that's a significant problem. Second, Bonneville needs to proceed with all due speed with the Raver-Schultz SCPs and the Portland 230 upgrades. And as I said when discussing those in earlier slides, I think that's proceeding as indicated. The energization dates for those are 2025 for the Raver-Schultz Raver SCPs, and 2026 for the Portland 230 upgrade and the 500 megawatts of additional cross-cascade transfer capacity that'll provide. Third, BPA needs to do a regional study. Now, Bonneville can do these things. Northern Grid is the FERC chartered entity of which Bonneville is a part to do this, but especially for the Oregon and Washington, Bonneville alone can do most of this stuff. It has to coordinate with the other utilities, but it has the ability to do this. The problem is Bonneville's workload is overwhelming, given the doubling of TSRs that it has to analyze in the various cluster studies, and given staffing constraints and other priorities, they're not likely going to be able to, at least what they're telling me, to do this until late, for another couple of years. That's an awfully long time before we know what the next major transmission addition beyond those two incremental ones that I mentioned before needs to be. And the problem is, if it involves any kind of substantial transmission construction, either 230 or 500, you're into a 10 to 15 year period. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's a possibility. And the Raver-Paul issue that I mentioned before could well be the kind of thing that you have to do. The $750 million there is because if you had to meet all those TSRs, you'd have to build another you'd have to convert a portion of the Cooley Olympia 287 line to 500. And that's a 10 plus year process and $750 million. So we'll have to see, but the sooner Bonneville can get what's the next major transmission project study done, the better off we'll be. As finally, we will need, in my view, The PAC and Idaho Power, who are building the Boardman to Hemingway line and the Gateway West line, in PAC's case, need to complete those lines. When completed, that will enable a transfer of about 1,500 megawatts of Utah solar and Wyoming wind into the Northwest. Now, that'll get it to Boardman, but you still have to get it from Boardman to Covington for Puget, which is the main Bonneville substation serving Puget, or into PGE's service territory. And that is a non-trivial kind of task, but unless you have B2H and Gateway West, you don't even have that option. So you need to do, to do those two things, irrespective of the Bonneville issues. Next slide, please. You also, next slide. You also have some interim measures, and I won't spend a lot of time on these. Bonneville has a conditional firm product that it provides, that a couple of conditional firm products, and one of them is their reassessment product, where you can get conditional firm, what's called conditional firm transmission, almost as good as firm. You can get it, it's interruptible for 200 hours a year for any purpose. But the problem with the reassessment product is it's only available for 2 years, and then it's a jump ball as to whether you get it extended or not, or canceled. You could extend that product to probably 5 or 6 years, maybe vary the interval curtailment hours, and that would give you some flexibility. It also could look at, there are vendors that provide what I'll call power flow control devices. These are devices that are kind of like mini series caps, in that you can hang them on the lines, you can put them in a substation. They're much cheaper than the series caps or other things, and they can be installed within a year. Or you can put them in a trailer, a mobile trailer somewhere along the right of way, and do this. Again, those would enable you to reschedule power, to offload some of your more heavily loaded lines onto lesser loaded lines. These are not substitutes for major transmission, but they could give you some additional flexibility in the next 8 years. Next slide, please. So what do we conclude? Well, east-west transmission is a major challenge, both on Cross Cascade North and Cross Cascade South, and potentially, although I don't have it mentioned here, on Raber Paul. And we just have to be able to identify, based on the submitted transmission service requests and other contingencies, what the art of the possible is here. But suffice it to say, there are significant issues associated with whether we have sufficient east to west transmission to meet the 2030 clean energy goals of both Oregon and Washington. Puget thinks it does. PGE is pretty sure it doesn't. That's in summary. But even whether Puget thinks it does, it's still nervous, I guess I'd have to say, about the level of transmission that's available and whether that's sufficient or not. The problem here is, Megan alluded to this, with whether it's an RTO or even a day-ahead market. If you don't have sufficient transmission to meet your clean energy goals, you significantly suboptimize the regional diversity benefits you get from a day-ahead market or an RTO. You can do it. You'll get some benefits. You maybe get a half of them or a third of them, but you need the transmission to fully maximize the amount of benefits you get from forming these regional organizations. You get economic benefits that help lower rates or keep rate increases down, and you get reliability benefits in terms of the resource adequacy program that the power pool is now undertaking. And finally, one other factor here that I didn't mention, but it's hanging out there, is none of these conclusions about adequate transmission really take into account much additional electricity growth due to electric vehicles or to gas displacement. And most of the studies you see the EV curve not really starting to pick up until 2030 or so. So maybe we're okay. But if you have a big rush to acquire EVs and a lot of electricity load growth as a result of that, none of the studies, the utilities account for some modest amount, but if that really comes in and picks up significantly post 2025, that gives us a whole new chunk of additional renewables we have to acquire that basically aren't even accounted for in the models now. So, end of discussion. That ends my presentation.
Great. Randy, thank you. We got several questions in the chat. I want to ask you to address. The first one is, Randy, is there east to west capacity across Canada that might be utilized with improved north to south transmission lines instead of focusing on east-west across the Cascades?
No.
Nope.
And
Okay.
that's the simple answer. Yes, there's some, but it's already fully loaded and it's involved with transmission between Alberta and BC Hydro, which is fairly limited. But right now the limit is less in Canada, especially in 2025, when the brand new hydro project called Site C will come in. You'll have an additional 1,000 megawatts of hydropower. The problem is at the border, you've got an 1,800 megawatt transfer limitation. And then once you get over the border near Blaine, you have other transfer limitations just to get through the Puget Sound area to get to Western Washington or down to Portland. So there are transmission north-south transmission limits in BC that are the big constraint there.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of questions in chat, and then Katie, I'll come to you with a verbal question. Next question, Randy, is are the PSE, PGE energy and capacity needs based on today's loads, or do they take into account load growth by 2030, both from increased population and industry demands?
They take into account load growth as part of their IRP planning process. And the only thing that I'd say is what I repeated at the end of the presentation is that, if you have an unexpected, adoption or purchase of electric vehicles, you've got a risk out there that's more in the high scenarios that those utilities have studied than in the midpoint scenarios, and that could be an issue. But yeah, they take into account load growth as best those utilities can estimate it.
Great, Randy, thank you. Next question, and Randy, if you can't answer this question, I'm going to invite other folks on the call who have insight on this to answer the question. Would Washington State's position to transition away from natural gas affect the possibility of creating generation in Western Washington to offset the transmission from Eastern Washington?
Well, it's a good question. And my guess is Puget is going to test that. And the question is, are they serious about building this as a real dual fueled CT between now and after 2030? They have to use basically, renewable fuel of some sort, whether it's RNG or biodiesel. But are they intending to install this and run it? They'll still have to meet their 80% clean energy requirements, even if they run the West Side CT on natural gas. But are they going to do that, or is this more of a trial balloon to kind of see? But politically, that's going to be a significant issue, I'm sure. But it has real benefits in terms of both reliability, and freeing up more east to west transmission for renewables to get into their system.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Okay, so Katie, I'm going to come to you now, and then I've got one other question in the chat, two other questions in the chat here. So Katie?
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to emphasize something Randy said that often gets lost in these discussions around power flow controls and grid enhancing technologies more generally and their potential. So I'm going to put a link in the chat that takes you to a Brattle study from last year called Unlocking the Queue that looked at a case study in Kansas and Oklahoma, two very wind-rich states in the Southwest Power Pool, and looked at, business as usual versus deploying these GETs, grid enhancing technologies, in the next 5 years, considering everything that's in the queue, which is 9.4 gigawatts. And they found that with the use of GETs, they were able to double the amount of renewable energy integrated onto the grid. And I wanted to highlight there are really no strong policy incentives here in Washington for deploying these sort of things. Maybe the solicitation process is mysterious. I think these conversations need to be had. And I also want to call attention to a federal funding opportunity where U.S. Department of Energy has, I think, $3 billion on the table rolling out later this year to be utilities will be eligible, state and local governments will be eligible, IPPs, to apply and get this funding and cut in half the costs of building these projects. So wanted to call that out. Thanks.
Great. Katie, thank you. And we'll look for that link in the chat. Okay, so this is what's going to happen. I've got one more question for you, Randy. And then I want to see if Bonneville Power or PSE or anyone who we've been talking about here on the phone has anything that they want to add. Let's see here. Next question is, Randy, are there any thoughts on the merits of a couple of high voltage direct current concepts, for instance, down the Columbia River to Metro Portland and from BC Vancouver Island down Olympic Peninsula to Olympia?
Yes, there are some. There is specifically one that's being studied right now. That's going to be proposed by it's called the Columbia, the Cascade Renewable Transmission Project, that would actually, I think start at John Day and go to Hillsborough, go under the Columbia River. All kinds of issues obviously there, but these guys are pretty sophisticated. And it's not cheap. I mean, it's in the $1 billion range, but it would provide you with 1,100 megawatts of additional transfer capability along that Cross Cascade South pathway. So that's one that's under active. Well, it hasn't been formally proposed yet, but it will be, and it's worth taking a look at, even though it's got significant issues there. It's one way to do this. There are other more, I'd say, theoretical possibilities. One that's been discussed, is you could look to build you could look to extend the line from Colstrip east with a direct current line that gets you into either SPP or the MISO service territory that would connect those two us with the Northwest with either MISO or SPP, would provide you with a lot of additional flexibility. Huge, significant costs, significant issues, but that's an example of, and others have posed DC lines, within the Northwest. There are all kinds of issues associated with that, but there's those kinds of alternatives are starting to get very active discussions. And like I said, the Cascade Renewable Transmission Project is a real project. It's in Northern Grid right now, as I understand it.
Great, thank you. So I've got two final hands here, and so I'm going to have Anders. I'm going to come to you, and then Megan, you're going to have the last word on this, and then we're going to then Kathleen, I'll see if you have anything else, and then we'll take a break. Anders. Anders, we can't hear you right now.
You're muted, Anders.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, great. I guess I'd just add that I think it's really important that when talking about which new transmission lines are needed and which ones should be prioritized, that we really match up the expected supply with the expected demand. And Randy mentioned the concept of the gold rush, and we do see the really high volume of transmission service requests, and later this spring we'll have some updated information to release on which upgrades would be needed to respond to those requests. But I think it's really important that that you match up what the load serving entities need with what the developers are providing in order to determine when how much we can fit with these smaller upgrades like the series capacitors, and then when it's time to trigger one of the the 9 or 10 figure major upgrades.
Great, Anders, thank you. Megan.
My big opportunity to bring it all home, but I was going to follow up on and ask a question to Randy about sort of institutional. You said the concept that Glenn brought up about north to south DC and the real project that is currently in Northern Grid, those are worth taking a look at. When you say they're worth taking a look at, sort of, I think my struggle is, where do you think they're worth taking a look at institutionally? How do you think we would answer a question about whether those are useful, that type of thing is useful or needed over a 20-year horizon rather than the 10-year horizon that the Northern Grid looks at? And, I guess to connect to what Anders said, I absolutely agree that there needs to be this match. And frankly, it's disappointing that we have so many TSRs that we don't have time for that, kind of broader planning that would give us a longer time frame and a more general look at something like these needs over 20 years. I don't know, Randy, do you have just a simple answer to that question of where one should?
Yeah, I do. Bonneville, simple answer. Northern Grid is, right now, to be blunt about it, Northern Grid is not functional. We've had it for 3-4 years. We have yet to get any decent studies out of it that I'm aware of that address this problem, which everybody admits, is a key problem. And so I would ask, I would say that the commissions need to engage Bonneville and the question should be, when, Bonneville, can you get the study done? I agree with Anders. You don't want to build more than you have, but right now, all we have are cluster studies, which, you're right, are not a good metric of the measure of what the demand is. They're great about supply because every developer, that's their chance to submit. But probably only 5 or 10%, 10, maybe 10, 20% of the projects is submitted, TSR submitted for transmission, or for projects that will ever get built in a cluster study. So but you need to sort through that, and Bonneville is the best equipped to do the study. And the problem is they're so overloaded. I'll defer to Anders, although this is probably above his pay grade to answer the question, but their staff is so overloaded analyzing all of these TSRs in the cluster study, which is a FERC requirement, that they don't have time to get to the really important question that you ask is, do we need anything beyond the series caps and the Portland 230 upgrade to get to 2030 for the 80% goals? And if so, what is that? And what Bonneville's telling me, at least, is it's going to be late 2024 before we're going to have enough time to analyze that. Well, when I talked to Larry Beckett, all the PG, he says, I need it in 6 months. Well, there's kind of a critical mismatch from my perspective between what PGE and others, and Puget for that matter too, are saying they need and what Bonneville says when it can deliver. That's a problem, but Bonneville is the right organization, and maybe I'm biased on that, but unless Northern Grid can get its act together, we need Bonneville to do that, and then other utilities have to be coordinated with as appropriate, whether that's PGE or Puget or PAC or whoever, as part of that process, and that'll happen. But right now, it's not happening sufficiently quickly.